Nicolas, welcome back to Defence Deconstructed.
Thank you for having me.
So we just saw each other down in Washington, D.C. at the NATO Public Forum for the 75th anniversary of NATO and that summit. But you were actually down there both for that as well as another adjacent event focused on defense industrial participation, development, production. Just offer some comments about that particular experience and what was discussed there.
Yeah, sure. Well, the United States Chamber of Commerce and NATO hosted a defense industry forum on Tuesday as part of the overall summit activities. And it shows the continued importance that defense industrial capacity is playing at the heart of NATO's strategic agenda. It's not some technical issue anymore for functionaries. It's really at the key political and continuing to grow in momentum. We saw it first last year at Vilnius with the Defense Production Action Plan and the institutionalization of those commitments over the last year. And so the United States wanted to make this a key part, as did NATO, front and center. And so, this was one way to bring together across the alliance defense industry to talk about the importance of a resilient capacity and how, what you bring from a defense industry perspective is a new form of burden sharing.
And related to that, and that, as you said, that very recent, but I think quite clear. There was lots of discussion in the public forum beyond the one that you participated in that wider public forum that I was at. Similar discussion periodically on a sustained basis about the importance of industrial production to the alliance, and including a statement by the alliance with an industrial production directive. Just offer a bit of perspective on what you thought of that shift.
Yeah, so this is one way that the momentum is continuing to grow around this sense of urgency and change, importance around readiness as well. And so they've put out a defense industrial capacity pledge at the leaders level, again, so reflecting the importance at the highest levels of the alliance. And it talks about, expanding defense and commits to expanding defense industrial capacity. It talks about the investments, sustained increase spending that has to then, be turned into signed contracts, firm orders, and accelerating all these efforts across the alliance, trying to figure out how to do that, efforts around standardization, so that more of the equipment can be used, especially in terms of battle decisive munitions. That builds on the kind of standard setting role that NATO has played. But all of this is also reflective of the changing NATO defense planning process that has happened over the last years, from the strategic concept out of Madrid in 2023 to the regional battle plans that were set in Vilnius, to then here, where there is an order of magnitude change of what is required for the alliance and members through the NATO defense planning process, the minimum capability requirements. Just as an example, it's about how many forces can be fielded ready in 10 days, 30 days, and 100 days, going from like what it used to be around 30,000 now up to 500,000, and all of the parts, support elements, logistics around that. And that is a huge lift for industries across the alliance because of the kind of the magnitude of the change, which I don't think is quite understood here in Canada, the degree to which the situation has changed and the actions that allies are taking. And we certainly saw that around the debates that we heard and mentions around some of the other commitments that Canada has made and not quite lived up to.
I was really quite struck at the close of the session. There was a discussion with Admiral Bauer, the NATO chairman. I think a couple of things I remember him saying. Essentially, the alliance has evolved and is now getting ready to actually fight a war against a peer adversary in a way that we really hadn't been before. We were sort of positioning for deterrence. And I think it was one of the senior American officials at one point who had made a comment that our industrial production had really been oriented around a deterrent effect. So producing enough meaningful capability to try and deter conflict. But now there's a shift in recognition that we have to pivot from that to actually having the productive capacity to be able to deal with actual conflict, which wouldn't necessarily just be over in a matter of short days with a pure adversary.
Yeah, that's right. And replenishing what the donations we've made to Ukraine. And so all of this takes real effort. And, the pledge is one way to get nations to focus and see it as important to act. One of the issues that Europeans have had, for example, is financial institutions not wanting to support investments in defense. There's one case that the EU came across that a defense company was being denied access to the electrical grid. Here in Canada, we have EDC and BDC who won't service defense activities even for allies. And so, there's work that has to be done here that we are pushing on to make sure that can be rectified.
One of the things that kind of in a peripheral conversation tied into this, but came up in some of the formal discussions, was also a recognition that the rule set, the regulatory regime governing the collective defense industrial production needs to evolve, and in a recognition that we need to be able to better coordinate, better pool our resources. And there was a lot of discussion about how some of that can evolve. Some of that focused in particular about some of the AUKUS partnerships in the U.S. trying to evolve the defense regulatory environment to be able to export key technology to those partners. But in a wider alliance context, discussion about how you basically align some of that regulatory environment, how you align and coordinate things better. I was quite struck that there seemed to be no recognition whatsoever that there is one country who's already inside that American regulatory environment and could therefore very easily make a quick and direct contribution through access and collaboration with the United States, and that's Canada. Just your sense of kind of that, where Canada's potential space in this sits within those wider discussions.
Well, certainly with the Americans, I think, one thing that I noticed, in my visits there is, we've forgotten that lesson that was essential coming out of 9/11 in the United States. Security trumps trade. And, when we saw the setup of the Canadian delegation, the Prime Minister going down, he said he's going down to talk trade. Well, we need to talk security. And this was the week to talk security with our closest allies, because Washington is full of many other priorities that aren't Canadian priorities, and mind share among a very diffuse political system from Congress to the executive branch with competing priorities. If you don't have mind share, you can't push an agenda in a coordinated fashion. It's hard to, maintain what you have when other allies are talking the language of the Americans and when we're not. And so, this has been a challenge where I think we're losing ground. And, we see it in the nature of the debate that we've seen this week in the media and the reporting around even the 2% number. One thing that I noticed, and not sure what you thought, but the alliance, many members of it, have moved beyond 2%. This is wholly inadequate, is what they were saying. The leaders of Estonia, Denmark, Czech Republic, on one panel, saying, that is not enough. The Brits are looking to move to 2.5. And so, this idea of, well, maybe one day we'll get there, I think is a real challenge. And, my conclusion around the debate in Canada is that we really need to stop drinking our own bathwater here. We have made progress in the last few years, but it remains fundamentally inadequate to the threat and to the relative progress that most of our allies have made and who started ahead of us and have increased at a faster pace. It remains inadequate essentially to the expectations of our closest allies. You look at the magnitude of change that Sweden giving up neutrality after 200 years has made, Finland as well, and the significant change to its defense policy. And Canadian public interventions come across to our allies as complacency, unimaginative excuses, and in a way, a weak exceptionalism. Just because our allies are being polite and diplomatic and less in public, frankly, it doesn't mean they aren't serious about our deficiencies. And they are looking at where we present liabilities to them in collective defense plans. Not just that, we're less relevant around key strategic discussions that are happening, where we're no longer being invited to key meetings, less able to get the meetings that we used to. And this is certainly something that I've heard when talking with NATO allies in my work. And, I think that security and defense experts in Canada who should know better should, not be taken in by yesterday's press release. If you look at the language of that press release, um, it says that Canada expects to spend 2% by 2032, which is several election cycles down the way. And there's no timeline, no prioritization, and no money. It's not in the fiscal framework. And so it is an unconvincing pinky promise after the government has twice decided, and after deliberation through defense policy reviews, not to meet that commitment. And the track record of past promises, I think, speak for themselves. In 2017, Canada committed to hit 1.4% in 2024. We achieved that once during the pandemic when GDP tanked, and haven't hit it since. And the target of 1.76, again, just some number, in the new defense policy, was never really put out with the kind of detail and transparency that would give confidence about how we would hit that number. And, so this is even more in terms of, 2% from the discussions in Washington and the nature of those debates that were happening on the margins of the summit is not some crass mathematical calculation that turns people off. It's a serious commitment in respect of our allies and the security situation and the need to make sure that Ukraine wins. And it's an amount of money that is a serious commitment. And we need to think through, if we've already made this commitment, how we get there, and a serious plan to do that. It is essentially a strategic mind shift change in Canada that we haven't yet seen, that acknowledges this deteriorated security environment and will have major overhaul of people, processes, the support to the industrial base in Canada that meets the scale of the threat. And so we have a long way to go.
Just to take off on that last comment you made there, and thinking about, so for us to turn that prime ministerial expectation into reality, what do we need to do to meet that particular directive? But now that industrial production is more closely, for good reason, being included as part of an actual national contribution towards the wider alliance and in burden sharing, what are some of the steps that you'd be looking for the government to take to start turning that into actionable progress?
Well, I think part of this starts with a new relationship with industry that Minister Blair committed to in the defense policy update, strategic persistent engagement. So it is a way in which to have those conversations, to set priorities that both industry and government agree on, and focus. It's about identifying key sovereign capabilities. What does the Canadian Armed Forces need and want to be made, maintained in Canada for military effect, and sometimes for economic considerations, and some mix thereof. And where do we need to change the processes of procurement? What additional tools and instruments do we have? In Canada, there is no department that's responsible for the health and resilience of the Canadian Defence Industrial Base. You asked that question of Bill Matthews and Simon Kennedy in November, and both said, not I. They both have different instruments that are quite outdated. But, what are the new instruments that we need? The Defence Production Act in Canada hasn't been looked at in decades. The French have just updated theirs to adopt some measures that the Americans have had about how to prioritize, inputs where they could go to a commercial, use or a military use, to say, well, we really need some of the inputs, for example, for ammunition and around energetics, instead of dynamite for more condos, to build more condos in Toronto. We'll need to reappropriate that for use in military production. That's one example. Another one is around then requiring stockpiles. So the just-in-time, lowest-cost delivery approach that has been pervasive for the last decades is no longer enough. So there's lots of different things that we need to do, making sure as well that the sourcing of those inputs is reliable and from trusted sources. So it's setting a common agenda and having the mechanism to do that. That's the first part.
I was quite struck in that space that I think some of the problems that Canada is dealing with in that respect aren't totally unique to what our allies have experienced. I guess my takeaway from the last couple of days is that the other allies are actually moving forward to change some of those parameters, recognizing that they've got limitations in terms of those industrial base linkages, that it's not prepared enough, that some of those considerations in terms of the relationship with government, all of those different factors, they weren't adequate to the task at hand. But looking at our allies, they are moving forward already with plans to start correcting that now. And I think, from my observation, that's we haven't seen. We've got the problem recognition in Canada. I think hopefully, but waiting to see the turn to actually start doing something to change that.
I'd agree. First is intent, and then capability and capacity to make the changes that you agree on.
Well, Nicolas, thanks very much for joining us for some short takeaways from the summit. Appreciate you coming back to Defence Deconstructed.
Thanks. Have a good day.